Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. Learning how to mix properly can be an overwhelming experience. This is especially true when you're picking up disjointed tidbits of information on different articles and YouTube videos. Mine are no exception, by the way. It can seem like you need all of these advanced techniques to get the sound that you're going for, and it can seem like the information you're acquiring today can be in direct contradiction to the information you acquired yesterday. And so in this video, I wanted to get back to basics and share 12 steps that you can follow to build a strong foundational base for your mixing endeavors. The techniques and concepts I'll be sharing in this video may seem basic, but I can assure you that they are the essentials to get down in order to get a strong foundation to build upon in your mixing. If you can understand and regularly practice what I'm going to teach in this video, I can guarantee you that your mixes will get better. And so with that, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started. All right, the first important step I think we should be taking when learning how to mix is to develop an understanding of how we actually hear sound, not only in the frequency content or our audible frequency range, but also in the binaural nature of our hearing. We have two ears, and that's how we locate sounds in free space around us. And stereo audio takes advantage of all of this, particularly if we're listening on good stereo monitors or stereo headphones. And so if we can develop a strong understanding of how we perceive sound, then we can be that much better and that much more effective in making mixing decisions that will benefit the mix and how we hear the mix upon playback. Starting with how we perceive different frequencies, you can see here that I brought up the equal loudness contours right here. I will link this image in the description box down below. It's from Wikipedia. And just quickly, we have frequencies on the x-axis right here, spanning from 10 hertz to 100,000 hertz. On the y-axis, we have sound pressure level in decibels sound pressure level, or dBSPL. This ranges from negative 10 dBSPL all the way up to 130. This is near the threshold of pain, and our threshold of hearing is around 0. And then these red lines right here are represented by FON. FON is a logarithmic unit, much like a decibel, which represents our perception of loudness. And so if we break things down quickly here, you see that these lines start at 20 hertz right here, and they end somewhere around 20,000 hertz up here. The universally accepted range of human hearing is from 20 to 20,000 hertz. And so that is what you see here. As we age, we'll often lose a lot of our sensitivity in the upper range. For example, I can hear up to about 16,500 hertz. I'm 30 years old. I think I did a lot of damage in my early years playing in metal bands, playing in hardcore bands, going to shows and the like. It's very important to wear ear protection if you are going out to shows or you are practicing in loud environments. A lot of this damage is irreparable and it will only get worse with age, and so watch out for that. And then you see down here that the line starts going up toward the low end, and the low end frequencies we actually feel more than we hear. So if you've ever stood in front of a large subwoofer, whether you're at a show or in a nice studio, you can feel a visceral feeling of that bass in your chest, even more so than you can hear it. And so looking at these lines here, for example, at the threshold of human hearing, so anything below this line we can't hear, anything above this line we can hear, we need a lot more sound pressure level, a lot more energy at 20 hertz than we do, say, at 3000 hertz right here. And even if we consider the threshold of human hearing as being 0 dBSPL, which is kind of what it was designed to be, that only actually holds true somewhere between this 1000 and 2000 range, and then somewhere around 5000 right here. We can actually perceive sound under 0 dBSPL in our most sensitive region right here between about 2 and 5K. And so we are most sensitive right here where the lines are the lowest, and we are least sensitive where the lines are the highest. Another very interesting thing worth noting in this graph is that the lines actually start flattening out as we increase the sound pressure level. And so at 100 FON, this is much louder than say 20 or 40 in the way that we perceive loudness. We can actually hear a more balanced frequency response at higher listening levels. And so the main point I want to get across here, especially for beginners, is that we are the most sensitive in this mid-range, and we are much less sensitive to the extreme high ends and the extreme low ends. And so when we're mixing, we should be focusing primarily on the mid-range, and we should try to not push the extreme low end or the extreme high end too high in the mix, because it kind of goes against our nature and how we hear things, and will also take up a lot of headroom and often lead to lackluster results. So for example, when I started producing hip hop and electronic music, I really pushed the low end frequencies really high in the mix, and that ate up a lot of headroom and actually didn't really help me to bring out the bass elements. It just made a messy, subpar mix. And so it took me a while to figure this out, particularly in the low end. And there are different tricks that we can utilize to enhance the presence of bass instruments, like saturation, bringing out harmonic content of the bass instruments in this mid-range. Once again, we are the most sensitive to the mid-range. And then also high pass filtering a lot of the tracks that don't actually have important energy in the low end to make room for the low end energy of the bass elements in the mix. But that's not the main point I want to focus on here. The main point, again, is that we are the most sensitive in the mid-range, and we should focus primarily on that when mixing, and we are less sensitive to the very low end and the very high end. Another thing to take into account is that we have two ears and we hear sounds binaurally, and stereo mixes take advantage of this with a left channel which should hit our left ear first and a right channel which should hit our right ear first. And so the differences between the left and right channel, or the differences between the sound waves that hit our left and right ear, will give us a sense of directionality. And it's actually the differences between the left and right channels in a stereo mix that lead to this width, that lead to this directionality in the mix. And so the primary tool we have for this is using pan pots. So for example, if I take this guitar right here and solo it, I can alter the panning or the directionality of this across the stereo panorama. All the way right, all the way left, right in the center. Beyond the simple hard panning of a mono source, we can also take into account stereo sources, and particularly I want to discuss the Haas effect. And so if I was to make this a stereo effect with the Haas, I'll just use this free plugin, Kilohertz Haas Mono to Stereo. We have a situation where in nature, if we have a single sound source and the sound coming from that source hits one ear before the other, we will hear that source as being toward the direction of the ear in which it hits first. And if the delay time between the sound hitting one ear versus the other is below about 40 milliseconds, then we will hear that source as a single source. And if it's greater than about 40 milliseconds, then we will hear it as two distinct sounds or as an echo. And so I can demonstrate this for you right here with this same guitar. If I play this and I can utilize this Haas effect to control the delay, and you see here that I am delaying the right channel. And so this plugin basically duplicated the mono channel to the left and right, and I'm only delaying the right channel here. So because the right channel is being delayed, we should hear it trending toward the left. There's some bleed there, but you can hear it as a single sound source. And it almost widens out, especially if you're listening on nice headphones. Still hear it as a single source. Then if I really bring this up, now we can hear it as two distinct sound sources, or an echo. And so we need to take this into account when we are mixing, particularly in stereo, that we do have two ears, and that stereo mixing will help take advantage of that and give us some directionality in the stereo panorama. I do have a couple videos going into more depth. One is on the Haas effect in particular, and then another one is on getting more width out of our mixes. I will leave links to those in the description box down below if you'd like to check them out. Step number 2 when learning how to mix, in my opinion, is understanding that mixing is just one step in the entirety of the music production process. In order to get a great mix, we need great songwriting, we need great arrangement, we need great tracking or recording, we need great editing. Then comes mixing, and then we have mastering. And much like we can't master a bad mix and expect it to sound good, we can't mix something that was poorly written, poorly arranged, poorly tracked, and poorly edited. And so if we have a look at this mix a little bit closer, we have a drummer, we have a bass player, we have two guitarists, we have a sax player, a trumpet player, trombone player, a lead vocalist, and a background vocalist and keyboard player. So there are 9 people in this band, a great local band, great musicians, and they did a very good job in the tracking process. They got the rhythm section down first, that is the bass, drums, and guitars. Then they overdubbed the horns, and then they overdubbed the vocals on top. And so the songwriting is great on this, the arrangement is great. There are some instances where the horns and vocals kind of compete, but other than that, the guitars really sit in their own pockets. The drums and bass work really well together. The vocals and background vocals play off of each other really well. And the overall tonality of the musicians and their instruments work really well in this mix. Other than the bleed, which is to be expected when you're recording drums, bass, and guitars all in the same room, I think that the recording was done excellently. And then when I got the multi-tracks, I did a little bit of drum editing, a little bit of drum replacement, a little bit of vocal tuning, a little bit of horn tuning, and then a little bit of timing for the horns and the vocals right here, just to make sure that everything was sitting as perfectly as possible while still maintaining the vibe and the feel of, in this case, an R&B soul track. And so before I even got into the mixing stage of this, the song was already written, it was arranged really nicely, it was recorded really nicely, and I spent quite a bit of time editing in order to get the best results possible before even getting into the mix. So if you're a beginner mixer and you're struggling to get the results that you want out of your mixes, it could be that you're lacking the fundamentals and the skills, of course, but it could be that you're starting off with something that is virtually unmixable because the tracking was bad, you didn't spend enough time editing to make things sound nice and clean and professional, or the arrangement is just going to give you way too many problems throughout the mix. So that is something to keep in mind when you are learning how to mix. Step number 3, which ties in nicely to step number 2, is having a dedicated system for organizing and preparing your mixes. And so after I get my editing done, I make sure to set up my mixer the way I like it so that I'm not having every one of my mix sessions look different. It's very easy for me to come in, know where my drums are, know where my bass is, know where my guitars are, and so on, because I always set up my drums first right here. I have them all sent to bus 1 as a subgroup. Then I have my bass always being sent to bus 2. Then I have my guitars, then I have my horns in this case, and then I have my vocals. After that, I will generally set up my effects returns in parallel processing. If I bring this mixer up right here, I have my parallel compression for my drums on bus 11, my snare plate on bus 12, and then depending on the mix, I will use different delays. Typically, I'll have a stereo delay on bus 13. I actually brought that over here. You can see right after the sax. And then bus 14, I have a mono delay. Bus 15 and 16 are both mono guitar verbs that are hard panned. This is either for same side reverb or opposite side reverb of the two guitars. And so these are common processing that I use, and then I will often opt to add in some additional effects returns for my vocal reverbs, other parallel compression, and other effects that I'd like to add into the mix. Beyond the mixer right here, I also go in and put in my markers, and I will often do this when I start editing, just as a way to quickly be able to jump around the arrangement view to know exactly where I am in the song. I have a full video going into detail about my mix preparation and organization process. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below if you'd like more information. But I want to encourage you in this video to set up a system that works for you and then to follow that system as much as possible through each one of your mixes. I guarantee it will make things easier from mix to mix, and it will also make things easier whenever you have to jump back to a mix that you did previously. You can jump into that session and know exactly where things are because you have this dedicated organizational process that you go through. Step number 4 I have for you when it comes to mixing is at least learning how to gain stage. I know that this is kind of a hot topic here on YouTube. Some people love gain staging and swear by it. Other people say it's absolute rubbish. I personally use it in my mixes, and I would encourage you to at least learn how to do it and then decide for yourself whether it is worth doing in your mixes or not. And so what I do for gain staging is before I have any other processes right here, you see that all of my audio tracks have this gain plugin on it. This is just the built-in trim plugin in Logic Pro. And what I do here is I will set all of my faders at 0 dB, and I will adjust the gain so that I'm hitting the same average level on each of my tracks, typically around -18 to -21 dBFS. And by doing so, I will have each and every one of my tracks at the same perceived level when their faders are at unity or 0 dBFS. And then if I go through and properly A/B and level match each of my plugins so that the audio level is the same whether the plugin is on or off, then I will have a situation at the end of the day where I can simply look at these faders right here and know what is louder and what is quieter in the mix. And so the main benefit of gain staging for me is that it helps make everything relative in terms of our faders down here. It makes balancing with our faders that much more visual and intuitive when it comes to the mix. And so for example, right here, you can see that my effects are way down. I don't want the effects to overtake the dry tracks. If we go over here, I want the trombones to stand out a little bit more, and so on and so forth here. Other benefits of gain staging are not overloading your tracks by having too hot a level. With modern digital audio workstations typically working in 32 floating, I don't think that this is a major issue. Another benefit of gain staging that people like talking about is that it won't overload and make any analog emulation plugins we have, such as, for example, the SSL E-channel strip or the CLA76 here. It won't feed these analog emulation plugins too much level and cause distortion. However, people have been overloading analog equipment for ages now, and while these are benefits of gain staging, I think that the main benefit here, especially for beginning mixers, is to have our faders represent relative levels of our tracks. So again, if we are properly level matching each of our plugins, then this would mean that what we see is what we get here. We aren't going to have situations where in order to get the same level, for example, between these two toms, if they were recorded at different levels, we may need one tom to be at +6 and another tom to be at -15 in order to have the same perceived loudness. With gain staging, we avoid all of that so that if these volume faders, all else being equal, are at the same level, then they will be at the same perceived level within the mix. So as an additional note, along with gain staging, I also want to talk about level matching, and that is simply opting to, within our plugins, have the same level whether the plugin is turned on or off. And so that typically means adjusting the output. In this case, with the SSL channel, we have an output fader right here, which we can adjust, and then we can A/B test to hear whether the signal is the same level with this plugin turned on or off. And this will help us to avoid the loudness bias when it comes to A/Bing our plugins. The loudness bias being our natural bias to think that things that are louder sound better, even though this is not always the case. And so to level match, to have things the same level, whether a plugin is turned on and off, will give us a more objective view as to whether that plugin is actually helping the mix or not. And so along with gain staging, I would highly recommend level matching and A/B testing each and every one of your plugins. These processes demand a lot of discipline out of us, but it can be worthwhile to develop them as habits as we go through our mixes. It can take a little bit of time to develop these habits, but especially when starting out, I think that they are worthwhile if you want to get the best results out of your mix. And once again, once you learn how to do these things, I think it's perfectly fine to break these rules that I'm setting in place. There ultimately are no rules when it comes to creative endeavors like mixing, but I think that these steps are worthwhile to, again, understand and to actually perform in our mixes in order to get better results. So that is step 4 I have for you. Step 5 is to learn how to balance the mix. The actual balance with faders and with pan pots makes up 80% or more, I reckon, in the mix. Mixing is ultimately all about balance, and the faders and pan pots are the primary tools we have to achieve a great balance in the mix. And so I would implore you to try balance-only mixes where you are only using faders and pan pots, no other processes whatsoever, and just see what you can get out of the mix with just faders and pan pots. All of the other processes are important for getting to the best results possible, that extra 20%. But again, if we're taking the Pareto principle into effect, where 80% of our results are going to come from 20% of our efforts, the process that is going to get us the most out of the mix is balancing. And so learning how to properly balance with faders and with pan pots is essential for learning how to mix. I do have an ebook dedicated to mixing with faders and pan pots. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below. And furthermore, if we want to talk a little bit about our typical processes, we can even relate them to balancing. For example, we can think of EQ as frequency-dependent balance control or frequency-dependent faders. And actually, if I was to open up a graphic EQ here, like the GEQ, we can actually see that we have faders at each frequency right here. And so EQ can be thought of frequency-dependent balancing. Compressors can be thought about like automatic balance control. They work by essentially lowering the volume of the track as that track gets too loud. So we can actually think of compressors as automatic fader control. So as something comes too loud, we actually pull down the volume. And then as it gets back to an average level or anything below the threshold, then it comes back up to where it was originally. And so again, when we think about balancing the mix, faders and pan pots are the #1 tools we have. And then 2 of our most important processes, EQ and compression, tie directly into balancing, whether that is frequency-dependent balance or automatic balance. But when learning how to mix, I would highly encourage you to spend a few mixes just balancing with your faders and your pan pots and seeing what results you can get out of that without worrying about utilizing any other processes. I think you'll be better off for it. Step number 6 I have for you when learning how to mix is to take advantage of high-pass filtering and high-pass filter the majority of our tracks that don't have significant musical information in the low end to make room for those tracks that do. And so if we remember step number 1, where we talked about the equal loudness contours, we saw that we aren't very sensitive to the very low end. And so it's important that the low end frequencies within our mix are nice and clean. There isn't too much clutter and phase cancellation going on in there so that we have a fighting chance at actually hearing and feeling those frequencies in the low end. And so the 2 most common elements that are going to have significant low end energy are the kick drum and the bass, whether that's a bass guitar, a bass synth, 808 samples, or the like. And most other instruments aren't going to have significant musical energy in the low end, although they may have a lot of low end energy. And so if there is a lot of low end energy, say in a vocal recording, and the actual vocals don't have musical information in the low end, that low end energy in the vocal can interfere with the low end energy in the kick drum or the bass element, cause phase cancellation and ultimately ruin the low end of the mix. And so if we do have a look at the lead vocal, for example, right here, and I open up the SSL channel strip, you can see that I am high pass filtering the vocal at 115 hertz. And so I'm rolling off the frequency with EQ starting at 115 hertz. Actually, technically, it's starting a little bit above 115 hertz, and we're hitting that negative 3 dB at 115, but I digress. The main point here is that I'm axing off a lot of that low-end energy that would otherwise interfere with the kick drum, with the bass guitar, making more room for the kick and the bass to really shine through in the mix. And so to reiterate here, the very low end takes up a lot of energy in order to be heard. That energy will eat up headroom and muddy up the mix, making it really hard for us to get our mixes loud and competitive, and also throwing off the overall frequency content of the mix. Furthermore, having too much clutter in the low end will really ruin the clarity of the actual instruments that have musical energy in the low end. And so while it's not always necessary to high pass our tracks, it is something that I would warn you to look out for, especially when you're starting mixing. This is another rule in mixing that I would implore you to break once you learn, but I would highly encourage you to learn how to high pass most of your tracks and to make that a sort of habit that you go to. And then once you feel comfortable mixing, you can decide whether or not you actually want to high pass your tracks or not. It's often the case that tracks are recorded without a significant amount of noise or rumble in the low end and they don't actually need high pass filtering, but it can be a nice safeguard in the meantime when you're learning how to mix, just to go ahead and high pass the majority of your tracks that don't have significant musical information in that low end. Step number 7 I have for you when you are learning how to mix is to understand how effects returns work. And so in modern digital audio workstations and computers with high CPU, it can be tempting to just load up our tracks with all sorts of plugins, all sorts of inserts, because it's perfectly possible for us to do this. However, historically, it's been the case that we may have a single reverb or a single delay unit in a studio, and we had to take advantage of utilizing just that one piece of gear. And so we would send a bunch of different audio tracks to it. That is in effect send, and then we would output from that piece of gear back into the mixing console. That is the return. And so that's basically what an effects return is. And while it certainly does have historic context in the overall timeline of mixing, it's also a very useful technique in mixing in order to get a sense of glue and cohesion within our mix. It also helps to declutter our mix, and in the cases where we are running computers with lower CPU, it will help tremendously with CPU overload, latency issues, and overall crashing of our digital audio workstations. And so if we weren't using effects returns in our mix and I wanted a reverb on the vocal, for example, I could go here, go down to audio units. Let's go choose the Soundtoys little plate. This is a go-to plugin for me on vocals, and I would go mono to stereo maybe. So we have a stereo reverb right here, and we do have this wet dry mix. So if this is all the way dry, then it's only the dry signal, so no reverb is being outputted by this plugin. And then if I'm all the way wet, it's only the reverberant signal coming out of this plugin. So somewhere in the middle, I could mix this reverb with the vocal, and that is perfectly fine. We can totally do this. It would sound something like this if I had it in solo.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the
100% dry,
ground?
100% wet.
Grounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make when.
So let's say I wanted that as my reverb sound on my vocal, but then I also wanted the background vocals to have that same reverb. Well, then I would have to duplicate this and bring it over. In the case of Logic, I could hold down Option and just drag this over. And now I would have the same reverb on all of my vocals, my lead vocal, my background vocal, and my second background vocal. Now, if I wanted to change the sound of this reverb on all 3 of these vocals, I would have to go in, maybe I wanted 8 seconds. Let's say for example's sake, I would go through each of these, set it to 8 seconds. And there I would have the same reverb once again on these vocals. However, an easier way of doing that, I will actually close all of these, is to select all of these. Get rid of that auxiliary track, click right here on a send, and I can actually send this to bus 29. Let's bring the actual send up to unity. So I will option click. So now we are sending at unity, and these are post pan, so post fader and post pan. So the actual audio being sent to bus 29 from these channels is based on the signal level after the fader. So if I was to move the fader, I would control the amount that is being sent here. That may be a little bit advanced, but if we scroll over right here, I can call this Vox Reverb. And we see here that this is bus 29. We are sending to bus 29 from each of these vocals. And then bus 29 is the input on this channel. And now what I can do is I can go here, choose the little plate, And now this little plate is affecting each and every one of those vocals. So I have one plugin versus 3, and if I want to make any changes, I can just go to this single plugin and make the changes that I want. In terms of the mix, I'm now going to have this 100% wet. So I have the dry channels being outputted to bus 6 right here, which is my vocal bus, which is being outputted to the mix bus. And then I have this little plate over here on this effects return, which I have 100% wet, so it's only outputting reverb. And then I have a independent fader control over it right here, so I no longer have to actually go in to these plugins and adjust the wet dry mix if I wanted to bring in more reverb or less reverb within the mix. And so there's a whole bunch of benefits that come with learning how to utilize effects returns. You don't absolutely need to use them, but they are a huge benefit in mixing. The first is that we utilize fewer plugins. And if you're having CPU issues and crashing issues and latency issues, this can be a big benefit. 2 is that it helps to glue things together. 3, it helps us save time only having one plugin, and we can go in and just adjust the settings on one plugin to get the desired results across multiple tracks being fed into it. And 4, it offers us independent control, and then we don't have to go in and actually mess about with the wet-dry mix, which will also alter the amount of dry signal. And so this independent control is superb for getting a fader for the wet and a fader for the dry, rather than relying on these knobs right here. So effects returns are excellent choices for time-based effects like reverb and delay. They're also great for parallel processing, for example, parallel compression, parallel saturation, and any other processing where we want to separate and have independent control over the wet and the dry signals, and also where we want to send multiple tracks to a single effect. Rather than having to insert that same effect or that same plugin on each individual track, we can do that with a single effects return. I do have a video going into more detail on routing and effects returns. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below. I sort of glossed over things right here, and if you're just beginning, that may have been a bit more advanced for you. So if you would like to learn more information, I would encourage you to check out that video. Again, I'll leave a link in the description box down below. Step number 8 I have for anybody learning to mix is to understand the basics of automation. So music is effectively sound or audio changing over time, and automation allows us to change parameters of different things over time within the mix. And so it ties directly into mixing to make things more dynamic and more exciting throughout the mix. So the main thing that we will be automating in our mixes is the fader control, or in other words, the level of different tracks within our mixes. So in Logic Pro, I can hit the hotkey A to open up our automation lanes. And you can see here that I have quite a bit of volume automation. You can see right here what I am actually automating. So I have volume automation on the overheads, on the drum subgroup, on the snares VCA right here, which is controlling the snare bottom, snare sample, and snare top. And I have some other automation going on here. For example, the amount that I'm sending to send 3, which is a big snare reverb effects return. But the main point I want to get across is to get comfortable automating not only these chorus moves right here, where in this case, I wanted the kick to be louder in the final chorus and the outro versus the rest of the song, but also to get more fine-tune automation right here, where I actually went through and in real time adjusted the levels of the overheads to just push them a little hot on downbeats and then to bring them back down on the majority of the drums right here. It's important to remember that the majority of mixing is about balancing, particularly with faders, and it's often the case that in certain sections we can get a balance perfect with the faders, but then in the next section the balance kind of falls apart, and so that is where automation comes in. We can actually adjust the faders throughout the song. They don't have to be static throughout the entire song, and we can use automation to make that happen. Once we're comfortable with fader automation, we can move on to automating other parameters like panning, or if we go up once again, we can automate the amount that we are actually sending to our effects returns once we get comfortable with automation and utilizing effects returns. And so this can be a lot. I want you to focus on what is manageable for you, especially if you are starting out. And so because we typically utilize automation for levels, I would encourage you to start automating your levels before moving on to more advanced automation parameters. The beautiful thing about automation is that we can pretty much automate whatever we want. For example, if I open up the automation parameter right here, I can go to the SSL channel, for example, and automate pretty much any parameters in this plugin. I can go to the CLA 76 and the same thing, the attack, whether the compressor is on or off, the input level, the metering, the mix, the decapitator right here. I can bypass it, adjust the drive, adjust the high cut, adjust the high slope. And so the options are basically limitless. A lot of those things I would never choose to automate. However, I do have the option there if I'd like to, and you have the option there if you'd like to as well, especially in modern digital audio workstations. It used to be the case on analog boards that we would output from the analog board to a recording head, and the engineer and musicians would actually be at the console turning knobs as the audio was being recorded. And now in digital audio workstations, we can actually draw things in or perform things in real time and have the automation play back when we play back the track. The next step I have for you when learning how to mix is to understand the basics of compression. And so to learn compression, let's go to perhaps the snare top, and let's turn off the compressors right here along with the clipper. And I'm going to open up the FabFilter Pro C2 so that we have a nice graphic interface to help visualize what we're doing with compression. And so to understand compression, there's a lot that goes into it, but basically we are setting up a process with a threshold that is a set signal level. And then as a signal level going into the compressor goes above that set threshold, the compressor is going to turn down the volume. Then as that signal level going into the compressor drops below the threshold, the compressor will bring the volume back up to what it was originally. And so this is best shown with a hard knee so that we have a very strong threshold right here. And then we have a ratio, which states that in this case, a 4:1 ratio means that for every 4 dB that goes into the compressor above that set threshold, only 1 dB will be outputted from the compressor. And so it's not the compressor's job to flatline and not allow a signal to surpass a set level. That's more so limiting. But it is the job of the compressor to turn things down as they get too loud. So once again, tying back into the overall balancing of a mix, compressors are effectively automatic balance controls or automatic dynamics controls. Furthermore, we have attack and release times, and this is where things start to get a little bit more complex, so I won't go into great detail about the attack and release times, but basically the attack time is how fast the compressor will react once the audio going into it surpasses that threshold, and then the release time is how fast that compressor will disengage once that signal level drops back down below the threshold. And so if we have a snare running into a compressor right here, I'll solo this. I'll bring down the threshold. You can see right here that we're getting a little bit of gain reduction. This is the red right here. So the majority of the time that snare is not going above this set threshold, but then whenever it does, it has a little bit of gain reduction applied to it. And so that is the very basic description of a compressor. We can utilize it to compress the dynamic range. That's why it's called a compressor. And it can help to tame wild peaks and tame transients of our signals. It can help to push things that are mixed loud in the mix even closer to the listener, and help push things that are more quiet in the mix even further from the listener. And in many cases, it can help to glue things together to make a more cohesive sounding mix. So when you're learning how to mix, I would highly encourage you to spend some time learning how compressors work. Each compressor works a little bit differently, but they're all based on this premise of automatic gain control, if you will. That gain reduction that happens automatically as a signal surpasses a set threshold. Compression is one of the most important processes we have in mixing, and I would highly encourage you once again to check it out for yourself. I have a video going into detail on all of the different parameters of compression. If you'd like to check that one out, I'll leave a link to that video in the description box down below. It's a little bit beyond the pay grade for this beginner video, but I think it will be worthwhile to check out now or in the future when you want to learn more about compressors. The next step, which piggybacks on compression right here, is actually understanding limiting, particularly on the mix bus or the master bus. And so if you're struggling to get your mixes as loud as your references, the main strategy for getting your mix loud is to utilize a limiter on the mix bus. In this case, I have the stereo out right here. And so we just learned that compressors will effectively turn down the level as a signal level tries to surpass a set threshold. And the ratio will tell the compressor how much to reduce the gain of the signal. When it comes to limiting, we effectively have a ratio of infinity to 1. And so the goal of a limiter is to set a ceiling, set that hard threshold, and not allow the signal to surpass that threshold ever. And so by using a limiter on the mix bus, we can add gain to the signal and make sure that we aren't actually clipping in the output. So if I open up this plugin right here, this is my go-to mastering and mix bus limiter. This is the Pro L2 from FabFilter. You see that I'm applying 8 dB of gain right here. I have an output right here of negative 0.1 dB. And so I'm avoiding surpassing that 0 dBFS clipping point in digital audio. I have oversampling turned on so that I'm not introducing intersample peaking that may actually go above 0 dBFS and cause clipping. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but effectively the gain right here is the gain that we apply to the signal, and then this output right here is the ceiling. And so if I bring this down and play this mix back, I can add gain.
Is it overwhelming? Forget
And much like the compressor right here, I'm actually getting some gain
Why
reduction.
do you laugh at me when I'm crying out?
And I can do that all without clipping the mix bus, so that when I export this song and reference it in my car, in my earbuds, against other tracks that have been professionally mixed and mastered, I can have things at relatively the same level so that it's easier to compare and contrast between my mix and my references. And so again, that is super basic. We don't want to push things too far in terms of gain because we will end up getting distortion. Let's have a listen to what that might sound like.
Is there something I can't control for you, dear? Is there...
So we often just want to touch it. I think I ended up at 8 dB, but I had these processes in line before the limiter when I settled on this 8 dB of gain right here. But the basics of limiting, again, is to bring up the level of our track up to a point just before distortion where we can get it as loud as possible without clipping and distorting the signal. So again, it can be at a relative loudness to that of the professional mixes that we are referencing against. As an aside, when learning how to mix, I would also encourage you to utilize reference mixes. I have a plugin right here that is my go-to plugin for A-Bing. It is by Mastering the Mix. It's called Reference 2. And with this one, you can simply click to add or drop files right here for your reference mixes, and then easily level match them and go between the original, your mix that you're working on, and the reference mix, what you're referencing against. I try to typically choose songs that have been professionally mixed, mastered, and commercially released in a similar genre or the same genre or style as the mix that I'm working on, or relying on what the clients want in terms of their reference mixes. I'll drag them into here. I will toggle between the original, my mix, and the reference mix. And this is a great way of doing it within the DAW itself, rather than having to jump from within the DAW into your music player and then back into your DAW, or to always have to export your mix and then take it elsewhere to reference against your reference mixes back to back. Here I can quickly toggle between the two, and I can even set up the timeline so that, for example, the climax of this song is lined up with the climax of the reference. It's just a great plugin to allow me to do that. But whether you choose to get a proper plugin like the Reference 2 for mastering the mix or not, I would highly recommend utilizing reference mixes in your mixes. And step number 11 I have when learning how to mix is to follow a dedicated plan of action. When I was learning how to mix, I was all over the place, learning techniques from these people, learning techniques from these people. They often contradicted each other. And oftentimes, after spending a lot of time learning, I was more confused than I was going into it. Now, I'm not saying that you have to listen to me and take everything I say as gospel. In fact, I would encourage you to check out some of my mixes down below. I'll leave links to those. And if you don't like my mixes, then don't take any of my advice on mixing. But I would highly encourage you to stick to a plan of action when learning how to mix, learn the fundamentals, and then branch out and start learning the advanced techniques. Again, you don't have to learn from me. I do have a few courses on mixing if you'd like to check them out. Links in the description box down below. But there's a lot to learn and a lot to know about mixing. And so I wanted to put this video together to kind of give you some introductory steps if you're just learning how to mix. And as a final step I have for you, I would highly encourage you again to follow a dedicated plan of action in order to learn how to mix. So that's what I've got for you inside of Logic Pro today. All right, I hope that this video will serve you as a roadmap to help you learn how to mix and to combat the overwhelm that often comes with learning how to mix. If you'd like to learn more, I do have a free mixing guidebook that walks through my entire framework for mixing from start to finish. It will be the first link in the description box down below. And again, that will walk you through the entire mixing process to help you make the right decisions at the right times to get better mixes. If you'd like to hang out more with me here on YouTube, I do have another few videos worth checking out in the top left and right corner. I would encourage you to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, do what you gotta do, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.